Hey everybody. I have noticed that some artists find aspect ratios a bit of a hard concept to understand, and how important understanding that can be. Many artists probably don't really think that they need aspect ratios. Well, until they do. I have a few other videos in the scripting stage that I mentioned aspect ratios, and I didn't want to have to repeat all this information in each of those videos, so I made this one for people that may not have quite a full understanding of aspect ratios. We're going to talk about why aspect ratios are important to understand, when you might use them, and explain them in the way you will understand. Let's talk aspect ratios. I'm Mark, and this is We Talk Art. I'm not saying, but it might be that artists don't like math. I think this might be one reason that some artists don't understand aspect ratios. On the surface, aspect ratios look a lot like fractions. And yeah, I know, who likes fractions? My goal is to get you to understand aspect ratios without talking about fractions and keeping the math easy. What is aspect ratio? It is simply a ratio of the width and height of your art, which is taking the width and the height after dividing them by the greatest common divisor to get the smallest number. Yeah, I know. This is where you want to stop this video and start watching puppy videos or something. Greatest common what? But hear me out. This is actually simpler than it sounds. Note that I'll be showing width and height of a piece of art in the format of 24 inches by 36 inches. I will say by and inches using the X, the time symbol. I'll be showing aspect ratios with a colon and usually saying 2, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, something along those lines. And the ratio should be expressed with the smallest possible numbers, and I won't say inches when I'm talking about aspect ratios. This verbal nomenclature is for this video and it's not really the norm across the board. I just want you to be able to understand when I'm talking about aspect ratios and when I'm talking about height and width of artwork. Let's first look at the two numbers of the aspect ratio, the width and the height. These two numbers describe the outside edge of your art, which can range from a square, a 1-to-1 aspect ratio, to a panoramic format such as a 1-to-3 aspect ratio, or even more. The 1-to-1 aspect ratio could be 1 inch to 1 inch, or it could be 1 foot to 1 foot. The sides are equal. The panoramic, the 1-to-3, can be 1 to 3 inches or 1 foot to 3 feet. In this case, the long side is 3 times longer than the short side. So it could be 10 inches by 30 inches. It is pretty obvious that something that fits into a 1-by-1 would take a lot of work to fit into a 1-by-3. Might also help to think about the numbers of the aspect ratios as units that can be anything. 2-to-3 aspect ratio is a frame that is 2 units wide by 3 units tall. So far, so good? You should also know that the most common way to express aspect ratios is width to height. So width coming first. Yet you will sometimes see this reversed, but normally width and height. So 2-to-3 is a portrait-oriented, height is the longest, and 3-to-2 is a landscape orientation with the width being longest. But both are basically the same aspect ratio. There are some common aspect ratios that you're going to see in art. As I said earlier, we have a 1-to-1, which is a square that could be 2 inches to 2 inches, up to 40 inches by 40 inches or larger. 3-to-4, that's going to get you a 6 inch by 8 inch or a 9 inch by 12 inch. It is also the aspect ratio of a classic tube TV and the photographs that come off your smartphone. The 2-to-3 aspect ratio will get you a 4 inch by 6 inch, an 8 inch by 12 inch, or even a 16 inch by 24 inch. It is also the aspect ratio of 35mm film and many digital camera sensors. A 4-to-5 aspect ratio gets you the 8 inch by 10 inch or the 16 by 20 inch, etc. Then you get into the 16 by 9 aspect ratio. That's your modern TVs, your computer monitors for the most part, YouTube videos that you're looking at me on right now. Then you get into the 2x1 and the 3x1. These panoramic formats work out to 20 inches by 10 inches, 30 inches by 15 inches, and the 3x1 can work out to be 36 by 12 inches. And there's many other ones. Some sizes or aspect ratios are the results of cutting down standard larger sheets that come from manufacturing, occasionally resulting in some odd aspect ratios. So be aware of that. A strategy for you as an artist would be to pick an aspect ratio for your art that would allow you to size your art up or down so it will maintain all of its proportions but just look larger or smaller. If you size your artwork up and down and do not pay attention to aspect ratios, it will either squish or stretch your proportions, making your artwork look wrong, or requiring you to crop off parts or add white bars on the side to make it fit into the aspect ratio that you're choosing. You can basically take any aspect ratio, such as a 2x3 aspect ratio, and multiply by any number and get a size that fits that aspect ratio. So let's say we take 4 inches. We'll multiply the width, 4 times 2 equals 8. And we'll take the height, 4 times 3 equals 12. So you would have an 8x12 piece of art, and it would still be that 2x3 aspect ratio. You can do this in reverse to find the aspect ratio by seeing what the largest number is that you can divide both the width and height of your artwork by to get the base aspect ratio. If we are working with a 24 inch by 36 inch piece of art, you can do this by listing all the numbers you can divide the width by, 24 inches, and the height by 36 inches, and find the largest number in both lists. This is the greatest common divisor. Pretty simple, right? So if you're working on that 24 inch by 36 inch print and you want to find the aspect ratio, with a little bit of work on a calculator or in your head, you can find the number is 12. So 24 divided by 12 is 2, 36 divided by 12 is 3, so the aspect ratio is 2 to 3. A helpful tip to find the greatest common divisor is to test some common aspect ratios such as 2 to 3 or 4 to 5, etc. against the width and height to see if you get the greatest common divisor. At some point, you'll probably be able to recognize aspect ratios just by looking at them or making a good guess. And you will also be able to find the greatest common divisor in your head. Although most of us now have calculators in our pocket that can make short order of all of that. Keep in mind, many of the art surfaces you will find in your art supply store will conform to the standard aspect ratios that I talked about before. But not all of them. For instance, Arch's watercolor paper comes in a 7x10. There's no greater common divisor, so the aspect ratio is 7 to 10. Also, popular sketchbooks like the 5 inch by 8 inch variety really don't conform to the standard aspect ratios either. Another trick is if you know the aspect ratio of your original, like that before 2 to 3, and you want to make a smaller print of it, you can take one of the numbers, let's say that you want to do the short edge to be 8 inches in the print. You can divide the 8 inches by the 2 to get 4, and that becomes your multiplier. You can then multiply the other number of the aspect ratio, such as 3, by that 4 and get 12. So you can make an 8x12 from that larger size print. So you can make an 8x12 print from that 2x3 aspect ratio image and get everything to fit. If you tried to make that an 8x10, you would have to cut some of the top and the bottom off to make it fit that 4 to 5 aspect ratio of the 8x10 inch image. This is why it's good to stick with one aspect ratio when you're sizing work. Here's a personal story about me bouncing off aspect ratios the hard way. At some point while I was learning digital photography, I realized that I could crop and print to any size, any aspect ratio. Why did I have to stick to the constraints of common photographs like 5x7, 8x10, 11x14, 16x20? I started to make prints of any size that I thought it would look good. But what I found out is that it can be very hard to display all those odd sizes. It requires custom matting, sometimes custom framing. Potential customers were not really happy with that. I also found that it was hard to make art pieces fit together into a body of work when they all were those wonky different sizes and shapes. I found pretty rapidly that it made sense to work within a few standard aspect ratios that worked well with my work. I learned to use this aspect ratio as a tool to help me compose for the end results. As a result, I feel like my work is better, and then I'm working in formats that people are more used to looking at. This is also important if you want to do preliminary sketches, reproductions, and prints. Sticking to aspect ratios that are common to your larger final surfaces or prints will allow you to scale in more common sizes for framing and display. What this means is that if you compose for a 4 to 5 aspect ratio, your art and composition will seamlessly work as an 8 by 10 inch, 16 by 20 inch, or a 24 by 30 inch, or even a 48 by 60 inch. These are all the same aspect ratios, and therefore they will all fit and look right in all those sizes. But if you try to fit it into a 20 inch by 30 inch, you'll be forced to recompose or crop some of it out because of that 2 by 3 aspect ratio. The 4 to 5 is closer to square and works for some subjects, and the 2 to 3 is more panoramic, as we've seen. For all artists that put your work on two-dimensional surfaces, aspect ratio is pretty important beyond that because it defines the frame, the edge, the border, the boundary of your art that your audience is going to look at it within. The shape of that border can have a profound impact on how people see the work and ultimately how effective the overall art is. As a result, you really should consider the shape, aspect ratio of your art as a compositional element of the art, and furthermore, part of the design and creation process. This compositional element will also change the way other compositional rules work, such as the golden rule, or the golden ratio, or the rule of thirds, all of which play out differently on different aspect ratio frames. So, aspect ratio is important to the look of your art. Simply choosing a size and shape of the piece of art that you're going to make based on the size of the paper or the canvas is missing out on one of the important compositional elements of your art. If you look at these 3 photos that I'm going to show you, you can see that the first photo, which is a 3 to 4 aspect ratio, makes the tree the subject and emphasizes that subject. The second photo, which is a 1 to 1 aspect ratio, has less focus on the tree, and the tree as the subject is less stated. And finally, the 3 to 2 aspect ratio changes the focus completely, and the tree is almost no longer the subject of the image. So you can see that aspect ratio and framing make a huge difference in the way the art will look and what it says. So choosing your aspect ratio and framing your subject in that frame is an important part of the compositional process. Other places that aspect ratio can be important is if you want to post your work online or in social media. You will find that Instagram, Facebook, and even some websites have a preferred aspect ratio and size. Not following these recommendations can have the platform cropping parts off of your image or putting black or white bars on the sides or top and bottom. Or you might need to put the bars on yourself if you want it to look right. Another quick note. If displaying on a computer screen, video, YouTube, TV is important, I will often try to compose to a 4 to 5 aspect ratio if I'm making a portrait-oriented piece, or a photo as opposed to a 2 by 3 aspect ratio. The 4 by 5 aspect ratio is going to be wider, taking up more of the screen real estate of the landscape monitor. So it is the more advisable size to use. But that is if you don't mind sacrificing some of that top and bottom. If doing that causes your image to change or is less good, then don't do it. Another challenge with that 16 to 9 aspect ratio of the TV and many other screens is fitting photos or art on it to fill the whole space. If you're taking a photo or making a piece of art that you want to fill the entire TV or computer screen, such as for a PowerPoint or Keynote presentation or a video, you'll have to remember that you are going to be forced to crop a lot of the top and the bottom off most image formats. Some cameras do have a mode for 16 to 9, but it's kind of a pain to set and then remember to turn off, and it doesn't take advantage of your entire sensor. When shooting, the standard aspect ratio for your phone is going to be 3 to 4 or 2 to 3 aspect ratio for DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. You will have to keep that 16:9 composition in your mind if you want to fill the entire screen with the image. The problem will be vertical elements in the scene that you'll want to contain within the image. Give them a lot of top and bottom room, otherwise you will not be able to make it wide enough to fill the entire screen. Now, I'm not advocating you allow the social media platforms to dictate your aspect ratio, unless social media is the final destination for your art. Platforms change, rules change, technology changes. I would much rather use the bars or a border to fit my art onto the required aspect ratio of the platform over cropping your work to fit or changing your artistic vision to fit these limits. If your primary audience is to see your physical work, use an aspect ratio that works for your vision, medium, or available surfaces. As you're probably figuring out, aspect ratio has different values in different situations. If you're just making physical art, aspect ratio should be used to support your art and your vision. If you're planning to display your work in other formats like prints, online, or in print, aspect ratio becomes important for how it will size up or down for that application. There are tools that will help you with aspect ratio and scaling. One of them is a photo editing software like Photoshop. Although many others will do the same thing, if you load up your image and go into the image size feature, you can lock the aspect ratio and then put a variety of numbers into the width or the height, and it will calculate the corresponding other to maintain that aspect ratio. This can be a really handy tool. Another old school tool is a proportion wheel. This will allow you to pick an aspect ratio or a size of artwork or surface and then figure out what other sizes would be that same aspect ratio. I'll put a link to this in the show notes. So really quickly, it's just as simple as taking, for instance, if you have an 8x10, you can set the 8 and 10 here on the wheel. And then you can look at all the different sizes. So you can go all the way down to the 4x5, which is actually the aspect ratio of that. But you can see that you can actually take that and size it up to all different sizes, such as a 10x12.5. Another advantage is you actually can see what the fractional sizes would be. But you can go up to a 16x20, you can go up to a 20x25, or you can go up to a 30x40 almost. So this allows you to really quickly set an aspect ratio or set a size and see all the other sizes that fit that aspect ratio. So this is a pretty handy tool. Another place that aspect ratio can be important is in the source you use to make your final artwork. If your goal is to make an art of a specific size, it is wise to make or get your source material, photographs or sketch, into an aspect ratio of your intended final art. This can avoid a lot of grief as you go through your composition in the early stages to ensure that it will translate to its final work. I have made this mistake of sketching and drawing and painting from source photographs that are the wrong aspect ratio, such as the 4:3 aspect ratio that comes out of my phone. And I try to sketch it into a 5" by 8" sketchbook. If I scale the 4:3 aspect ratio into my sketchbook, it would be either give me a 5" by 6.5" size or a 6 to 8" size. So I'd have to make it smaller than the page or crop some of it off. And then if my intent was to transfer that into something larger, such as a 16" by 24" canvas, which would be a 2:3 aspect ratio, I would again have to recompose to fit the new size. I think you're starting to see the problem here. So it is best to figure out what final size and aspect ratio, and then work the source around that. When working with photos and or sketches, it is best to make frames that are the target aspect ratio. If the target is 16 by 24, which is the 2:3 aspect ratio, first crop the photo to 2:3 aspect ratio, and then in the sketchbook, make a frame on the page that is the 2:3 aspect ratio, which would be 4" by 6". If you are working from real life, you can use another tool called a viewfinder that allows you to adjust it and see the aspect ratio as you look through it at your subject. I'll put a link to that in the description below also. If you're making art for graphic design applications, books, magazine, TV, web, advertising, etc., it will be important to work within the design parameters and especially the aspect ratio. Let's say you're asked to create a piece of art for a magazine layout and you need it to be 6 inches by 8 inches. That would be a 3:4 aspect ratio. You may want to create the art at a larger size to make it easier and also look better as you do the reduction for final print. Let's say it would be better if you could make your art, the long edge of it, 18 inches. So we can take the 18 and divide it by the 4 of that aspect ratio, the long side, and get 4.5. And then you would take that multiplier, the 4.5, and multiply it times the 3 side, the shorter side, to get 13.5 inches. So the original can be 13.5 by 18 inches to maintain that 3:4 aspect ratio and scale properly to the size to go to print. A similar task is necessary if you wish to do reproductions or printing of your artwork. You will need to determine your artwork's aspect ratio, as we've been doing all along. Keep in mind that the aspect ratio works in inches, centimeters, or pixels. If your goal is to make your work that fits into a standard ready-made frame, you should keep in mind that most of the common aspect ratios that you're going to deal with are 3:2 or 4:5, and sometimes that 1:1. If you're not working with one of the common aspect ratios and can't print to the common resulting sizes, you may need to contain your image into a border that fits in the next larger size that your printer might deal with or the ready-made frame you're trying to target. Surrounding the image with white or some color. This gives your customer some options to let them drop it into a ready-made frame or a mat, and it will fit the frame they like. Knowing the aspect ratio your work is in and knowing what sizes they can be printed to will save you a lot of time when you go and work with a printer. In summary, aspect ratio is just the width and the height of your artwork divided by the greatest common divisor. Figure out an aspect ratio for your work before you start creating is important for the best composition. Knowing the aspect ratio of your final work will allow you to configure your source material, including photos and sketches, to the best to assist you in making your final art. Understand how to use aspect ratio will allow you to scale your work to better work in reproductions, print, and fit into frames. Working within one or a few aspect ratios and size will make your body of work look a lot more consistent. I hope this overview of aspect ratios helps you out with your art making and sets you up for productivity in working with your vendors and your clients. If you have anything to contribute to this conversation or have a question, please leave it in the comments down below. Help out another artist. If you liked this content, please consider giving us a like and subscribe. It's free to you and it's really helpful for us. If you would like to watch more We Talk Art, I'll put 2 videos up on the screen here that you can click on. Otherwise, go make some art.